Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Overthink podcast YouTube series where we are talking to various experts from different disciplines on the five senses. Just as a reminder, this series is paired with our audio podcast 5-episode series on the five senses. And we are offering exclusive YouTube interviews here on our channel that are related to those episodes, but that are, quite distinct from them. So check out the audio podcast episodes if you haven't already, and definitely check out the other episodes in our YouTube series here. I am co-host Professor Ellie Anderson, and I'm going to turn it over to my fellow co-host, David.
Hi, everyone. So this is an interview that we're doing on the sense of hearing, and it is a very special interview to me because we have somebody who is an expert on the subject, but also a good friend of mine and a colleague, Cristina Ruotolo, who is a professor in the humanities at San Francisco State University. So we work at the same place, in the same department. We've spent a lot of time together. And she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on American culture, on music and society, on literary and musical modernisms. Cristina, you can talk about that as well as the interview goes along. But above all, she is the author of an amazing book on music and ways of hearing entitled Sounding Real: Musicality and American Literature at the Turn of the 20th Century. And in this book, Cristina looks at how this pivotal moment in American history, so the turn of the 20th century, was registered by and in American fiction. So she works on hearing, music, and literature, all of them in interaction with one another. So Cristina, welcome to our program.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and to have been asked.
No, that's great. And I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have because I'm familiar with your work now for several years, but our listeners and our viewers are not. So I'm very excited because your work bridges a lot of disciplines, which is part of what makes it really exciting. And so I want to begin by diving into one of the central arguments of your book, because we all know that musical traditions and values change with the passage of time. But in your book, Sounding Real, you make the argument that it's not just musical traditions themselves that are changing, but that our ways of hearing, and by that you mean literally like our practices, our institutions for hearing music, also evolve with the passage of time and are deeply historical. So I want you to talk to us about this phrase, ways of hearing, what you mean by that, and how it is that those ways change over, long or short historical periods.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, as you said, we're sort of used to thinking about change in music in terms of form and style. How sort of new styles emerge as composers or songwriters develop new musical ideas. But yeah, what I have been most interested in alongside that is how the contexts in which music is made and listened to and experienced and made meaning from are also changing in ways that can be very, very significant and can make the same piece of music, because of course now we have access to music from all times and places virtually, mean very, very different things, depending on context. And so part of that context is literally the spaces, the physical spaces in which music generally is made and happens and is received, the institutions that sort of govern who's a musician, who gets to be a musician, who gets to perform, how people are trained, how music is distributed, bought and sold under capitalism, for instance. And then also, so ways of hearing, right, can mean those things, but also I include in that the sort of more internal kind of processes that we use when we hear music that have to do with our own, usually, specific to our culture, but also sometimes very personal and private, ways of understanding the music that we're hearing or making, a sort of musical literacy, right? Sort of the language of music and the set of associations with music which of course is a language, but it's not representational. So it depends kind of on the listener to process based on what the listener understands and knows. So I include that in ways of hearing. And so, I mean, some really big sort of historical examples, right, are if we think within the Western context of the shift of composed music from like the church setting, the sacred space of the church, or the court setting, where music was performed and written specifically for occasions of the court, to in the like 18th and especially 19th century, to the concert hall, where music is being performed for a paying audience of whoever can buy a ticket. That's a very, very big change in context, right? That brings with it not only different musics, different kinds of music, but different sets of expectations for what you're going to get from the experience, different forms of attention. In a sacred space, you're already, focused in a certain way and sort of receiving the music in relation to a certain kind of spiritual practice, for instance. And then when then to make sort of big, broad historical brushstrokes, when the emergence of recording technologies and recorded sound allows for people now to hear music not just in live performance, but in their homes on recording devices, and to repeat the same experience over and over again, and to sort of bring them into their own spaces. These are extremely dramatic changes, right?
Yeah, of course.
That again can make sort of the same piece of music, let's say a Bach piece written for a church, a mass in church, performed on stage, performed in one's living room, or heard in one's living room. In addition to a host of other changes in those, informing those contexts, just the very act of hearing is going to be a very, very different kind of experience.
I want to quickly follow up on that and also just apologize. I look like I'm like crying right now. I have a cold right now. I thought I wasn't going to say anything at the beginning because I was like, oh, it'll be chill. Fully just had a coughing tag. That's why I left momentarily. Speaking of hearing, I turned my microphone on mute, so you hopefully didn't hear it.
We didn't hear anything. You're good.
Yeah, your answer was profound, Cristina, but that is not why tears are streaming from my eyes.
Oh, shoot. All right.
But I wanted to, kind of ask a follow-up about that. Super interesting answer, because I grew up in church choir singing. That's where my parents met, was at our church's choir. And I'm not religious anymore, but really that helped shape me. And I'm super grateful for that experience growing up. And I also did musical theater, and singing was a big part of my life for quite some time. Both my parents were professional singers. My mom was a lounge singer, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, very cool. Speaking of like different spaces. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But I wanted to actually kind of pick up on this idea of the recorded music that you mentioned, because I think one thing, whether it's performing music or listening to music live, there's a certain, not only unique temporality of that experience, but also a unique form of attention that you are giving to the music. And I think something that I often do when I'm listening to recorded music is just have it in the background. And I think one arguably could say that, especially with the rise of things like Spotify and Pandora and iTunes Music, or Apple Music rather, there's more and more emphasis on music as background music. It's almost unintelligible to me when I hear my mom, who's in her 70s, talk about having record listening parties with her friends as a teenager. Now it's like I listen to music in the car or while I'm cooking. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on that, this idea that music often, when we're listening to it in recorded settings, tends to become background music rather than being foregrounded in our attention.
I mean, for sure, right? And there's a history of that too. I'm right now sort of focused on the 20s and the 30s, the sort of era, the early era of the sound film, we call it the talkie, but really not only was talk introduced, but
Yeah.
music. And, there were always live performers playing music to silent films, but the soundtrack becomes a very different kind of background music, right, to the film.
Mhm.
That's very much coordinated with the action, and sort of becomes part of kind of the movement through time in a film, and the sort of channeling of emotional experience and things like that. Um, and I actually, I'm not quite sure where to go with this, but like my first
Mhm.
thought was, right, background music originally was kind of surreptitious, and it was, sort of the culture industry, the film industry used it to sort of shape the viewer's experience. And even today, I think film music is deemed most effective if you're not noticing it, right? If it's
Yeah,
sort of
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
invisibly shaping.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking about the sort of early uses of recorded sound in department stores, which was, and in
Yeah.
workplaces, as ways to
Ooh.
invisibly kind of shape the experience,
Mhm.
and put people in either the mood for buying, or in the mood
Yeah.
for working and not sort of getting depressed by, for instance, repetitive labor, right?
Mhm.
So the Muzak company, right, sort of
Wow.
specializes in this. So I'm sort of thinking about that, right? Because music is very powerful for shaping emotion, and can be used by the powers that be to control us, in
Mhm.
ways that we might want to think about, because it's invisible
Mhm.
and in the background. But then it's a
Yeah.
different thing to be a user oneself, and to have this technology at our fingertips, to then have some power over how we shape our own spaces with a sort of musical dimension, right? Our
Mhm.
time and our space, and I
Mhm.
think everyone has experienced that. Like, that's a real power, to be able to just sort of lift the spirits of the room by putting on a certain kind of music, or bring the spirits down by putting a different
Mhm.
Yeah.
um
Yeah, no, and
yeah.
it's interesting to think about that, for that forward and
I'm getting a
background.
lozenge, y'all. I'm coming right back.
Okay. It's really interesting to me to think about that forward, or the foreground and the background distinction here, Christina, because you're right. I mean, when I think about soundtrack in film, the times when I'm most kind of thrown off my game as a viewer of cinema is when I become conscious of that control function that is being performed by the soundtrack.
Yeah,
So
you
then
hate that, David. You
I
have talked to me
yes,
about this before.
yes,
You really hate
it
it.
really, really bothers me. It's not that it bothers me to know that there's a soundtrack in place that is doing emotional work, mood regulation. It bothers me when I become aware of that. And it just makes me think of about how much I've become accustomed to thinking about music precisely as this thing that has to stay beneath the threshold of consciousness. Because, for example, in a department store and my attention is on buying, I sometimes don't mind the music. But in an elevator, when there is nothing for my attention to grab hold to, the elevator music then steps into that role. And I really dislike it. And I feel a kind of claustrophobia where I feel engulfed by the music. So I'm wondering now, this is, we're going in new directions here on the spot.
That's fine.
And whether we might have some kind of individual and collective anxiety around sustaining a musical moment on its own without distraction, and how to make sense of that. Because
Mm.
when I think about the times when I just listen to music for the sake of listening to music, sadly, in my case, it really is limited to when I go dancing. And in those cases, it's not really even about the music. It's about a kind of
Mhm.
socializing with friends. So it just makes me think that I have a very poor soundscape that shapes my life, because it's just this background ghost like appearance.
Yeah. Um, wow. I kind of have a lot to say about that, but I'm trying to figure out how to organize my thoughts.
Be critical.
Um,
Let me have it.
yeah, because one can be critical, and I think
Mhm.
I'll go there
Yeah.
first, but then one can also kind of counter that with maybe a different way of thinking about it. Um, so right now, as I said, unlike my book, which focuses on the turn of the century, and that's an interesting moment, I also find the 30s a really interesting moment, the 30s and the 40s. because of new technologies, sort of introducing new possibilities for music. And I'm looking at it through the lens of these mostly Jewish, German, emigre modernist musicians who are very invested in modernist kind of experimental avant-garde music, and who are in particular really worried that a sort of loss in the ability to listen critically to music and to sustain attention on music and to sort of have musical literacy is a lot is at stake with that loss. And it's maybe in the case of the more intellectual of these people, like Adorno. I don't know if you've had any conversations about Adorno.
Not yet, but we talk about him a lot on the audio podcast.
Yeah. And this guy named Eisler, who Adorno wrote a book with about film music in the late 30s or early 40s, I always forget. There is in particular this sense that this introduction of film music and the sort of ways in which the new technologies are bringing music into people's lives is degrading people's ability to really hear it sort of critically and to hear it as a language that is actually saying something significant or has the power to say something significant. And that's sort of giving away power then to the corporations, let's say, who are pulling the strings on sort of what and how the music you're hearing is coming to you. So I'm just going to go back to your resistance to film that makes the score somehow suddenly come into the foreground for you, and how, yes, that's a disruption of what's become a real convention. So this guy Eisler, who was, a radical intellectual composer, but also just an amazing composer, was working in Berlin before he came to the US, and started working in Hollywood, and was struck by how different Hollywood was organized insofar as sort of the role of the composer, the film composer. Like, he'd been used to being sort of almost on a level with the director, where from the start of the film, there'd be a conversation about sort of what music would be doing at every moment. And that the music would be treated as a language like the words and the images, that was in dialogue with the other languages, that was sort of contributing rather than simply kind of invisibly supporting. Yeah. So he actually was funded by like the Rockefeller Foundation, which was funding a lot of work at the time in sort of the new technologies and music in particular. And did some experiments by rescoring films that people were familiar with, but trying to use music in a way that would be more active and more kind of involved in storytelling.
Wow, that is
and you would hate these movies. One of them is Grapes of Wrath, and I always show this to my students, and they're like, "Oh my God," because he's using like this modernist musical language that's sometimes like even overwhelming the dialogue, and you can't even hear the dialogue.
Oh, that's interesting, though. I think
it's
that's
quite interesting.
Because the thing that I dislike is when I think it's partly that the function of music in a lot of blockbusters and contemporary film that's not particularly experimental or thoughtful about the role of soundscapes is that the role of music gets reduced to mood regulation in accordance with the demands of the plot. So something sad is happening and you just have the violin just like rising in volume. And so I think it produces a kind of monocultural musicality where that's all the music does. It doesn't really have any complexity to it relative to text or sound or spoken word or the visual language of the film. It's just that it tells you when to be sad and when to be happy. And that's a kind of, the kind of puppeteer pulling on the strings and me feeling like my strings are actually being pulled.
Yeah. And it's doing so not only by sort of staying invisible and sort of keeping in its place, but also by using very conventionalized musical languages that we all, even if we don't read music, even if we think of ourselves as unmusical, we know them when we hear them. We know this is sad music. We know this is happy music. We know violins are romantic, and that's not like just given in nature. That's learned, right? Those are learned associations. So that was another thing that my guys, and we don't have to keep talking about my emigre modernists in the 30s, but they were very sort of concerned that film was really had an opportunity, in fact, to broaden the musical palette and sort of the possibilities for musical language for a broad public, right? Because everyone's going to the movies, but instead it's kind of reducing that language to very formulaic, generic, as you're calling them, mood regulators, which is a great phrase. Yeah.
Well, and in relation to this broad public and actually taking it in a bit of a different direction, you note in your work that there was a really close link between gender and race, these identity categories, and music in the late 19th and early 20th century, including this sort of period in the 30s that you're talking about. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that too. It's not just that composers at the time are addressing this broad public, but they're also sort of working with these gender and race, these categories rather of gender and race or different identity categories, right?
Yeah. Okay. So the turn of the 20th century is, a different time. We're before recorded sound. We're really even before silent film.
So we're moving from the film composers of the 30s back a little bit earlier.
But I think this is a really crucial kind of moment of change that sort of unleashes what is to come in the 20th century in terms of popular culture and music. I always have trouble being brief, so I want to try and cut to the chase of your question, but forgive me if I talk around it a little bit.
No, it's great.
So this is the moment, like 1890s, 1900 in the US, of the birth of a kind of centralized music industry that gets called Tin Pan Alley at that moment, right? Where instead of sort of itinerant songwriters who write popular songs that happen to, as we would say, go viral or take off, you have these sort of teams of songwriters who adopt a songwriting name and then like literally do market research and then produce songs to formula in order to sell them and then promote them in all sorts of sort of new ways, including
strangely similar today in certain respects.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole kind of effort to make songs catch on that involve things like hiring boys to whistle them in the streets to sort of create the impression that they've already caught on,
Wow.
Yeah. It's amazing, actually. I was really astonished when I learned these things. I mean, and that's just one of many such. Or having, when they're first being performed in like a musical theater situation, which is often where they were produced in sort of variety show, to have someone in the audience start singing along who was planted there. It's the first performance. So it's like no one could know this song. But these were to sell not recordings and not even like tickets to the shows, but sheet music, right? Because people bought sheet music and played the piano still and like played these songs in their homes. Okay, so where am I going with this? Identity politics. So in terms of race, because sort of race and gender are being brought into this in different ways, if not overlapping. But in the late 19th century, you start seeing many, many more Black songwriters and performers sort of entering in one way or another this Tin Pan Alley kind of driven mainstream music industry, sometimes as songwriters who are sort of passing, like people don't know they're Black because they're invisible. Sometimes as performers, sometimes as blackface performers, Black performers wore blackface. And they are tending to find work in particular producing a genre of song that has come out of blackface minstrelsy, which is, this very American form of popular culture that's very offensive to us, but was rooted in American society from the 1830s through the early 20th century, and had certain song genres attached to it that were in Black dialect, often performed by white people in blackface, conjuring up images of the sort of nostalgic images of the South, of the plantation, or, just sort of very caricatured, stereotyped, racist scenarios, but also incorporating certain Black musical elements that were imitated and sort of incorporated, such as syncopation, certain rhythmic patterns that would become known as ragtime in the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century. So there's this opening for Black musicians to kind of seize these racist, popular forms and to start writing their versions of it, either to like make money and get in on the action, cynically, or to try and make a difference and to sort of make them more authentic and to even start to claim, this is authentic ragtime. This is more true to our experience. There were great limits on how far they could go in that respect. But one of the writers I wrote about in my book worked as a songwriter, a lyricist with his brother, who was a composer / songwriter, to write these songs for Tin Pan Alley in the very early 20th century. And he was at first completely struck by this as a possibility for transformational work, for like infiltrating popular culture and making a difference in it. But only to grow very cynical after about 5 years. So, he had always been someone who wanted to do good work and to uplift his race. And he was doing so in the South as a lawyer, and he was a high school principal. This opportunity to write songs came up. I'm talking about James Weldon Johnson. I should have mentioned that. I mean, he's a well-known writer and intellectual and political figure. But he leaves everything. He leaves this life he's built for himself at the age of 40 and goes to New York to become part of this songwriting enterprise. And he's not alone in that. A lot of people end up coming to New York or to the cities in the North to work in songwriting. Okay, so identity politics. Okay, let's see. So I sort of started thinking about this through James Weldon Johnson's novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, which he starts writing before he even leaves this music business. And it very interestingly, it tells the story of a light-skinned biracial man who is trained as a musician, and that becomes his chief way of earning a living, who, the story is supposed to be sort of a way to reveal to the white reader the sort of diverse experiences and attitudes about race in America at the time. So he's sort of trying to tell a very big story about racial ideology at the turn of the century through this figure who's this biracial musician who can pass as white. And what becomes very interesting to me is the way in which the novel becomes a kind of exploration of his identity. Is he Black? Is he white? What does that mean? What does it mean to pass? And that story is largely told through his musical forms of expression. He first becomes trained as a classical pianist, and he's really good at it, and he loves it. He, at the same time, hears his mother playing spirituals on the piano and picks up from that a kind of style of playing that he brings to his classical playing. He then travels and finds himself in a nightclub in New York hearing ragtime for the first time and feels this incredible sense of identification with it. Even though he realizes he's very different from this pianist who doesn't know how to play classical music and isn't trained in the same way he is. He starts trying to play a new kind of music, Of course, it's something that's existing in the world that James Weldon Johnson knows, but in the world of the novel, it's this new kind of music that he's imagining as bringing his two traditions together. He rags the classics. He takes classical music and he transforms it using the kind of methods of ragtime. And that then becomes very popular, and he starts kind of earning a living doing that. Fast forward, he becomes kind of tired of that in ways that are quite significant, because in fact, the people hiring him are white leisure class people who are kind of disaffected and who want excitement and who just can't get enough of the music he's producing. And he becomes sort of depleted by that experience. His music is appropriated basically by these listeners who are hearing in it a kind of blackness, a kind of otherness, a kind of primitivism or whatever that's filling some need of theirs, but it's not doing anything for him. At which point he suddenly thinks, well, maybe I can switch it around and I can use classical music to incorporate Black music and sort of elevate Black music. This sort of world of entertainment is sort of reducing Blackness to a spectacle. What if I elevate Blackness to art, to what my culture imagines as art? And so he embarks on this project of writing a Black symphony, and then goes and does some research in the South in an effort to really get this music at its source. And he goes to a Black church and listens to the music being produced in the church. And this is the sort of turning point at the end of the novel, and I'm giving it away, but he breaks down and sort of feels, I can't appropriate this music and make it into something else. And there's no real explanation around that, but it just, he literally dissolves into tears and just sort of leaves, like Johnson himself sort of creates a space for just sort of narrating this scene in the Black church, which there's no audience, there's no stage, there's no performance. It's sort of a ritual space, right? Where everyone's singing, there's call and response. And to package it then as a sort of performance piece to be performed on a stage, within the economy of, New York City's high culture, suddenly just strikes him, or strikes the reader. I think we don't hear his thoughts as impossible. And that becomes a turning point. I mean, he witnesses a lynching and, the sort of racism of America rears its ugly head. And what's sort of powerful for me, just to now, I told you I'm long-winded, to cut to the chase, is that this novel really made clear to me that music was functioning for Johnson to explore kind of a moment of possibility and a sort of vision of kind of biracial culture, right? Of a culture where Blackness and whiteness are sort of informing each other, and maybe the boundary between them is blurring, just as it is in this character, only to, in the end, face the reality that America insists upon this boundary between Black and white. And in terms of music, does so really by othering Black music, and by a sort of musical economy that is performance-based, that commoditizes music, and that sort of cuts it off from its source. So it's very complex, but to me, it just sort of opened up just all sorts of ways of thinking about, in particular, music and race, and sort of what would buy musicality. I got this term from someone else also writing about sort of what it means to bring different musical traditions together, sort of European and African in this case, which are so different. I mean, they're rooted in they have such different trajectories, and then they just sort of come together in the US and in the Americas, in these ways that always seem to lead to appropriation of some kind, or sort of a power dynamic between the two
Yeah,
traditions.
but it seems like before that moment of appropriation, you're identifying two different directions in which the tension can be articulated. There is this introduction of non-classical music into European in origin and American classical music, but then there is this other direction in which that tension takes form, which is this notion that Black music ought to be elevated according to maybe the criteria and standards of this history of European classics, and kind of pushing in two directions at the same time, producing a really chaotic, like musically chaotic and racially and politically chaotic environment
Right.
all around hearing, again, which is, the thing that unifies these things. But one thing that stood out for me was your description of this character that before collapsing in tears, which is symbolic maybe of that moment of appropriation at the end of the novel. Earlier, you said that when he goes to New York, he gets kind of fascinated by the music. And it seems like this is what in your book you call a musical event. You talk about there being these moments when music just takes hold of an individual, it just grabs you and maybe shakes you in some way that's almost primal and fundamental. And I want you to say just a few things about this because it's such a powerful image, and I think many of us have experienced that at some point or another. Probably not with the elevator music, probably not with the blockbuster mood-setting soundtrack, although maybe. And I just want you to say how it is that music, in your view, has this power to produce in us these ruptures, or I don't know, maybe raptures, some kind of transcendence of the self.
And sadly, we are actually already out of time, but we really want to hear your answer to this question. So we will need to
You
keep
can
it
cut
quick.
out all that narration of the novel.
No, we like
it's
it.
great, Cristina.
Yes.
We really appreciate it, but just wanted to give you a quick opportunity to think about musical events.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a really important question, and I think it's what first drew me to sort of thinking about music's power is thinking about what, sort of really thinking, what is this power that that everyone can relate to in some ways. So I mean, I think, look, music is not representational, right? It's sort of taking us out of verbal language. It's not visual. We can close our eyes and listen to it. So it's sort of rupturing in a way our sort of way of making meaning in the world, through language and image. But it's also encountering us in a different way. It's literally penetrating our ears. I remember sort of the aha moment where I realized you can shut your eyes, but you can't shut your ears. There's a sort of openness, right, that's built into our bodies. And that sense of being penetrated, of being sort of immersed, being overwhelmed by sound, of resonating literally, to the sound. It's powerful, right? And it's different. And it can feel like a kind of seduction or a kind of loss of power, loss of agency that can be pleasurable, right? To give into. It can feel threatening for that same reason. And I think we haven't talked about gender, but it's a very feminizing experience, metaphorically and for some physically. And I always think back to the Odysseus myth of the sirens and having to sort of block his ears so as not to be seduced and taken off course. I think also part of the power of music is its temporality, right? Music unfolds in time. It's sort of organized temporally. So I think we've all had that experience of listening to music and sort of losing track of time, more not being aware of how much time is passing. I think, it can really pull us out of the rhythms and routines and sort of conventionality of everyday life into a kind of space and time that can, it can, like we've already talked about how it can sort of manipulate us and sort of make us do things maybe that we wouldn't otherwise do. But it can also maybe create a space for the imagination and for maybe an experience itself, right? That's not confined by our regular selves, right?
Well, that's so beautiful,
that's
Cristina.
wonderful.
A great note to end on. And yeah, thank you so much. I love all of this rich material that you've given us for thinking about musical events and, this just really a sonic experience. I know you're a violinist as well, so people can find your music too. So thank you so much for joining us. And okay, not recorded. Fascinating. Back to question one. Okay.
I play in private for an audience of one these days. I used to be a professional, but no longer.
Okay. All right. Fascinating. Yeah, tiebacks that I would love to pick your brain about. But thank you so much. And we're really grateful for your time and expertise. And viewers, thanks for watching this. Check out the rest of the series here on YouTube and on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Thank you very much, both of you.